Hello again everybody, so today I'm back and today I'm going to be doing a little tweak on my normal review format. Today, rather than reviewing an individual book, I'm going to be reviewing a series. So the reason I'm doing it in this way for this particular series is because it is definitely a series which you have to read in order, and I can't really talk about the things that develop in the second and third books unless you've read the first and the previous ones, and it's going to be a much more coherent review doing it this way. So I'm going to avoid spoilers literally almost completely, and it's just going to be me talking about why I love this trilogy, what I think about it as a whole, rather than the individual books. There are actually quite a few trilogies that I've read or I'm reading at the minute, so if you guys enjoy this format, please let me know down below. It's something I think I could do quite more regularly, kind of series or trilogy or even pairs of books reviews together, and I think it adds something a bit different, and also it just makes a lot more sense. So I'm going to get straight down into the review then. I'm going to use the same format as normal, where I'm going to talk about the concept, and then the plot, the characters, the writing, and then some overall thoughts. Talking about it as a whole trilogy means that some of those will tweak slightly, so for example, the way it's written and the way it's structured, I'll talk about it as a trilogy, not as an individual book and things like that, but it should fit really well and give you a really good insight into these books. I'm going to get straight down into the review then. Today, the trilogy I'm reviewing is the Red Rising trilogy by Pierce Brown. So if you've watched this channel, I talk about these books all the time. I've been desperate for the third book, Morning Star, to come out for the past year, and as soon as I got it, read it, devoured it, and really excited to let you guys know what I thought about the series as a whole. In terms of the general concept of the trilogy, it's not the most interesting trilogy in the world. It does seem, on the surface, very much a standard sci-fi dystopia. The basic plot is that the main character, Darrow, is a Red, and basically they were underground in colonies doing mining on Mars, and overseeing them there's a whole spectrum of different colours, with the Golds, who are like the rulers at the top, and they're basically like superhuman, almost biologically engineered, intelligent, strong, powerful rulers of the known universe. It's a really interesting concept when you look at it on there, but it is very similar to things in like Hunger Games and Divergent and The Maze Runner, where it is very much about an oppressive society. Because of that basic concept, it does tie into quite a lot of interesting issues, such as things like slavery, the concept of power and rulership, and racism to an extent. And it does, from the surface, look very interesting, if a bit samey. What does really stand out is there's a massive emphasis on Roman mythology. It's really interesting to see that though this is in the future, they've kind of moved backwards in a lot of what they talk about, so a lot of the names are very traditionally Roman names like Titus and Andromedus, and just really interesting Roman formats. And also a lot of the way the systems and the structures and the political systems formulated is very similar to the Roman way, and that's really unusual to see, especially in sci-fi and especially in futuristic books, and makes it really stand out. Following on from the concept then, the most important question is, how does the plot perform? Very, very well, it has to be said. It does do a lot to make itself stand out from the crowd of YA sci-fi dystopias. One of the main ways it manages to stand out and differentiate itself is that it is really brutal. There is so much death and violence, and it's really raw, and it's not YA. It's got a YA main character, but it's not a YA book. It's definitely an adult sci-fi, and that really makes it stand out and really makes a difference when you're reading it. It really hits you really hard and doesn't let up for 3 whole books. It's also not too difficult in terms of the sci-fi. It's not really hardcore, talking about fusion reactors and different forms of propulsion. It tells you the basic weapons that they're going to be using throughout, and that's about it. It just kind of fits otherwise, and that's really interesting. After the first 100 pages, you don't have to think about or try and understand any of the science behind it, and that's really enjoyable and really doesn't detract at all. It's also got an amazing scale. The books kind of progress to get larger scale, larger scale, larger scale. The first one's quite a narrow scale, but you get a really interesting idea of the kind of the situation, the political system. By the second and third book is literally galactic, the scale. You cover all these different worlds, all these different characters and people, and the scale of it is phenomenal, but so well managed. It doesn't feel unruly and like it's spiralling out of control. It stays quite neatly together as well. And undoubtedly, the main thing about this series is it is very twisty, and there's lots of intrigue, and there's lots of backstabbing, and lots of kind of political things. It draws a lot of comparisons with Game of Thrones on that front, that you never know who's on whose side and whose allegiance you can follow, and those kinds of things. And it means that every 50, 60 pages or so, there will be a massive bombshell that you don't expect, and that's really enjoyable too. I know what you're going to be thinking now is the characters. I've mentioned the scale of it. How does that correspond with character development? Really quite well is the answer. The author does a really good job. The supporting cast of characters I probably prefer to the main character. Every one of the main kind of 25-30 supporting characters has got a really unique identity. They're all interesting for some reason and they all have their own arc over the course of the trilogy. Darrow himself is quite interesting, don't get me wrong, but I just feel like he's a bit more standard and I wasn't as interested by him. I think the fact you also spend about 1,000 pages in his head as opposed to maybe 200 or 300 pages talking about other characters means it's not got the same excitement, you kind of get used to it. The supporting characters, the cast is kept quite nicely managed as well. It doesn't feel like it spirals, it feels like everyone's unique, and even if 500 pages later he refers to a character, you can kind of remember it all. Just the way it's formed and the way it's done, it really works on that front. Writing and structure then is going to be a bit different in this review to normal because I'm talking about it as a trilogy, not as one book. For me, what really stands out in this trilogy is that each book is quite distinctly different. The first book feels very much like Ender's Game, the classic Orson Scott Card book, in that it's very much about the development of the character and him creating his kind of combat acumen, his tactical acumen, and fitting into the ongoing systems. The second book is basically Game of Thrones, and that it's all political and twisty and violent and bloody. And the third book is kind of like a weird kind of... It's quite unique, the third book. It's got this really galactic scale. And it kind of combines elements of things like Game of Thrones, but also a lot of standard sci-fi. And it's just a really interesting mixture. But each book does have a really distinct identity, and that keeps it quite fresh. All in all, it's quite well formulated, and the ending is really good as well. The very, very last chapter, the epilogue, I could so do without. That feels too neat. But actually, the whole conclusion, it's really well built to, it's really well delivered, and it definitely feels like a great culmination to the 3 books you've read. It feels like a very much overall conclusion and really enjoyable. The quality of the books does vary. I think the second one for me was the strongest, which is rare. In a trilogy, the second book's normally the duffer that sets up the third book, but actually the second one really delivered the power punches for me, and that's going to be the one I look back on fondest, even though all 3 are of a really high quality. In terms of the writing, it's really interesting how it's done. It's not too complicated, it's not too flowery, but actually the words used and the way the characters speak is quite an intrinsic part of the plot. For example, there's different terminology used by different strata of society. Bloody damn and gory damn are used by Reds and Golds differently, and that's a really key part of the plot, and it's clever to link the writing in with that, because it means you're looking for those little clues as you go through. It's almost a bit like a crime novel the way it does that, and it really delivers in the end. So overall, what do I think about these books? It's probably my favourite trilogy ever. It's definitely my favourite sci-fi trilogy, my most anticipated books, the second 2 without a doubt, and they're just so well crafted as a series. I'm intrigued to see what the author does next. I don't want him to necessarily do more in this storyline. It could do more in this universe, because the universe crafted is amazing, but I don't want these characters to go through any more trauma, and I would like something a bit different from him. I think these, if you like sci-fi, if you're a young adult that's looking to progress into reading adult sci-fi or moving on to the next step, definitely read these. If you've read Game of Thrones and you want something similar but a bit different, read these. I would advise these to pretty much anybody with an even passing interest in sci-fi or dystopia. I gave the series as a whole a 9.5 out of 10, and I don't think it gets much better than these. So there we have it. That's my final thoughts on the Red Rising trilogy by Pierce Brown. It's a series that I've talked about a ton on here, I've been really excited about, and so excited to share with all you guys, and I'm really glad to be able to give you one last kind of thought explosion of what I think about this series. I'm going to try and move away from these and not talk about them every video from now on, because I know I did that for a while, but I think it's ones that a lot of you guys will enjoy, and I'm really glad to be able to talk to you about them all. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, it's super appreciated, and please comment if any of you have read this. I know I've had a few people already tell me that based on what I've said about this, they've picked it up and they're giving it a read, and I'm really intrigued to see what you guys think about it. Also, if you've got any suggestions about similar things, I need something like this in my life, so if you've got any suggestions for things similar that I can read based on what I've said, please leave that in the comments as well. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with my next video.